I never told my husband my dad owns $8 billion in his father company. For 5 years, he thought I was a broke army veteran scraping by. One night, he took me to a lavish dinner with his parents. I wanted to see how they would treat a poor soldier when the chips were down. His mother slid a white envelope across the mahogany table, telling me it was my severance package from their family. I smiled, tossed $100 bill on the table for my water, and walked out knowing I was about to dismantle their entire empire. My name is Riley. I am 33 years old, and until last night I thought I knew the man I married. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you ever had to stand up to people who underestimate your worth. The private dining room at Le Cuckoo was suffocatingly quiet. I sat with perfectly straight posture, a habit drilled into me by a decade in the United States Army managing global logistics. I knew how to read a room. Tonight, the room felt like an ambush. Across the mahogany table sat my husband, Harrison Montgomery. At 35 years old, the vice president of Montgomery Marine possessed the polished good looks that required generational wealth. But tonight, Harrison was staring intensely at his Wagyu steak, refusing to make eye contact with me. Flanking Harrison were his parents. Richard Montgomery, the chief executive officer, wore his bespoke suit like armor. Beside him sat Beatrice, a woman whose diamond necklace caught the dim restaurant lighting like shards of ice. Her eyes were locked onto me with undisguised contempt. Beatrice reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She placed her manicured fingers on the paper and slid it slowly across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my water glass. $50,000. Beatrice said, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth. Tax-free. It is a cashier check. I kept my eyes locked directly on my mother-in-law. Is this a bonus for tolerating Harrison and his golf stories, Beatrice? Or are we skipping straight to the insulting part of the evening? Richard scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. Do not play coy, Riley. We know your veteran nonprofit organization is barely scraping by. 50 grand is enough to pay off your student loans and put a down payment on a modest apartment far away from the Upper East Side. Or you can go back to that trailer park in Ohio. It was a small house in Ohio, Richard, I corrected him calmly. Not a trailer, but to a man who inherited his wealth, everything below a luxury penthouse looks like dirt. Harrison finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. Riley, stop it. Do not speak to my father that way. Then tell me why your mother is sliding an envelope across the table like we are conducting a cartel drop, Harrison. I stared at him, daring him to act like a man. Beatrice folded her hands neatly. It is a severance package. Harrison has attorneys who have already drafted the divorce papers. You will sign them without contesting the prenuptial agreement and take the $50,000 as a generous gesture of our goodwill. I looked at my husband. The man who chased me relentlessly, promising he did not care that I wore combat boots instead of designer heels. The man who swore my fierce independence was the trait he loved most. Is this true, Harrison? I asked, my voice steady. You brought your parents to dinner to fire me from our marriage. He could not meet my gaze. We are too different, Riley. You do not fit into this world. Montgomery Marine is restructuring. I need a wife who understands high society galas and social obligations. Not someone who spends weekends in dirty warehouses packing supply crates for homeless veterans. It is simply not a good look for a future chief executive officer. You need a prop, I said, my tone laced with absolute disgust. He needs a woman of his own class. Beatrice interjected, her eyes flashing with venom. You are a common soldier. You have no pedigree, no family name, and absolutely no assets. We have already arranged a proper match for him with the daughter of a prominent real estate developer. She has the financial connections Harrison needs to save the company optics. I let out a short, dry laugh. You have already arranged a match. You treat your 35-year-old son like a breeding horse just to merge corporate portfolios, and he just sits there and takes it like a coward. Watch your mouth, Richard snapped. You signed a bulletproof prenuptial agreement 5 years ago. You leave this family with exactly what you brought in, which is nothing. If you try to fight this, I will unleash a legal team that will bury you in litigation fees until you are living on the streets. Take the envelope, sign the papers, disappear forever. Consider it a highly generous parting gift. I did not cry. I slowly picked up my cloth napkin, wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my untouched plate. I did not touch the white envelope containing the $50,000. Instead, I reached into my tailored jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, and tossed it onto the center of the table. That is for the sparkling water, I said, standing up. My chair scraped against the polished hardwood floor. Harrison stood up too, panic suddenly flashing in his eyes. He had fully expected tears. He had expected me to beg for my marriage. Riley, please be reasonable. You have no money to fight us. Just take the check. Do not make this harder. I looked Harrison up and down. I spent 2 tours in the Middle East, Harrison. I have negotiated supply routes with warlords and stared down insurgents who would cut your throat for the watch on your wrist. Your father and his corporate lawyers do not scare me in the slightest. To me, they just sound like small dogs barking behind a very expensive fence. I turned my attention back to Richard and Beatrice, my eyes cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of fear. Keep your $50,000, Richard. You are going to need every single penny of it very soon. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room. My boots hit the floor with measured strikes, leaving my treacherous husband and his arrogant parents sitting in a deafening silence. The war had not just been declared. The first shot had been fired. The cold New York night air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the restaurant. Valets rushed past me in their crisp uniforms, expecting me to hand over a ticket for a luxury sedan. Instead, I bypassed them completely and walked a block down the street to where I had parked my battered Ford pickup truck. I climbed inside the cold cabin, the worn leather seat familiar and grounding. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but they were not shaking. I did not shed a single tear. Harrison and his family had expected a hysterical woman. They had expected me to beg for my marriage, to negotiate for a larger settlement, or to crumble under the weight of their corporate intimidation. They severely miscalculated. I glanced at the restaurant entrance through my rearview mirror. Through the thick glass doors, I could see Harrison pacing in the lobby, his hands running frantically through his hair, while Richard yelled at a staff member. They were rattled. My absolute refusal to play the victim had unsettled them deeply. They thought I was just a penniless veteran who had gotten lucky marrying into high society. They had no idea they were dealing with the sole heir to an $8 billion empire. I navigated the dense Manhattan traffic, steering my truck toward the Brooklyn townhouse I had shared with Harrison for the past 5 years. He had played the supportive partner perfectly. He had attended my veteran charity events, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with wounded soldiers, and claiming he admired my dedication to service. It was all a meticulously crafted performance. He used my military background and my nonprofit work to soften his ruthless corporate image. Now that his company was bleeding money from his own catastrophic failures, he needed a different kind of prop. He needed a billionaire daughter to bail out his sinking ship. He was throwing away a woman whose father could buy Montgomery Marine with pocket change, all to marry a woman whose family he hoped would save him. I pulled up to the townhouse. The lights were off. The property looked exactly the same as it did this morning, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like enemy territory. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence of the house pressed against my ears. I walked straight up the stairs to our master bedroom and grabbed my largest tactical duffel bag from the closet. I had packed for deployments in under 10 minutes. Packing for a divorce would take even less time. I went straight to the spare room, which served as my home office. I carefully took down my military shadow boxes, my medals, and the folded flag from my last deployment. These items represented honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. They did not belong in a house built on deceit. I packed my boots, my worn jeans, and the simple shirts I wore when working at the Veteran Rehabilitation Center. I packed the financial ledgers for my nonprofit organization. I made sure every single piece of my actual life was safely secured inside the heavy canvas bag. As I zipped the bag closed, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from Harrison. It read, "Riley, please come back to the restaurant. We need to handle this quietly. My father is furious and you are making a massive mistake by refusing the settlement. I will add 20,000 to the check if you just sign the papers tonight. Do not ruin your own life." I stared at the glowing screen. He still thought money was his ultimate weapon. He still thought he held all the power. I did not reply. Engaging with him now would only give him the satisfaction of a response. I needed to let him sweat. I needed him to wonder what my next move would be. I walked back into the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs looking down at the pristine living room. Harrison had insisted on buying this specific townhouse because it projected the right image for a rising corporate executive. I had spent 5 years trying to make it feel like a home cooking meals in the designer kitchen, hosting his colleagues and playing the part of the grounded, humble wife. I had kept my father and his massive fortune a complete secret, wanting Harrison to love me for who I was, not for my inheritance. My father, Thomas Reed, had always warned me that old money families like the Montgomerys only respected power and leverage. I had defended Harrison, assuring my father that my husband was different. I had been foolishly naive. My father had built Triton Holdings from the ground up, turning a small investment firm into a shadowy, unstoppable hedge fund that controlled vast portions of the global supply chain. He preferred to remain anonymous, operating behind layers of corporate shell companies. Nobody in New York high society knew his name, and nobody knew I was his daughter. I had kept that secret locked away, valuing my independence and my military career above my trust fund. But tonight that secret was going to become the very weapon I used to destroy the people who had tried to discard me. I picked up my tactical bag and slung it over my shoulder. I walked down the stairs, leaving the keys to the townhouse on the marble entry table. I climbed into my truck and drove away, leaving 5 years of false promises in the rearview mirror. I did not know exactly where I was going to sleep tonight, but I knew exactly what I was going to do tomorrow. I was going to call my father. I would ask him to look into the financial records of Montgomery Marine. I was going to burn Harrison Montgomery and his arrogant family straight to the damn ground. I drove 2 blocks before I slammed on the brakes. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white under the glow of the streetlights. I had told myself I was leaving to take the high road, to strategize from a distance and avoid a messy confrontation. But as I sat idling at a red light in the middle of Brooklyn, the bitter truth hit me. I was retreating. I was allowing Harrison and his wretched parents to dictate my movements. They wanted me to disappear quietly into the night, taking my meager belongings and fading into obscurity so they could finalize their corporate merger of a marriage without any bad press. I shifted my truck into reverse and whipped it around. I was not going to scurry off and sleep in my cab like a refugee. I had paid the mortgage on that townhouse for the last 6 months when Harrison claimed his executive bonuses were delayed by the board. I had renovated the guest room with my own hands. I was going back to the empty Brooklyn townhouse. If they wanted me out, they would have to face me in the cold light of day. I pulled back into the driveway and cut the engine. The silence of the house contrasted sharply with my racing mind. When I walked back through the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind me, the emptiness of the space felt entirely different. It was no longer a home tainted by betrayal. It was a tactical outpost. I carried my tactical bag back upstairs. I realized I had packed in a rush, reacting on pure adrenaline and hurt pride. A soldier never reacts. A soldier plans. I went into the master bedroom and turned on every harsh overhead light. I began packing my military gear properly, refusing to be a victim of their sudden ambush. I folded my combat uniforms with mechanical precision. I secured my medals and the commendations I had earned during my deployments overseas. Harrison had always hidden these items in the spare room, claiming they disrupted the modern aesthetic of his home. I saw clearly now that he was simply intimidated by achievements he could not buy with his father and his money. As I moved through the room, my mind processed the sheer audacity of the evening. They had offered me $50,000. The insult of that number burned deep in my chest. I ran a veteran nonprofit organization that supported hundreds of former service members transitioning back to civilian life. We provided housing assistance, job training, and vital mental health resources. I had poured my soul into that foundation, often working 80-hour weeks to secure funding and grants for people who truly needed them. Harrison knew exactly how much it meant to me. Yet he sat there slicing his Wagyu steak while his mother tried to buy my silence for a fraction of what they spend on a weekend getaway to the Hamptons. I walked into his expansive walk-in closet. Row after row of tailored suits, imported Italian leather shoes, and silk ties lined the walls. This was the armor of a man who fought his battles in air-conditioned boardrooms, using inherited leverage to crush anyone beneath him. I felt a sudden, intense wave of disgust. I had spent 5 years loving an absolute illusion. I pulled my combat boots from the back of the closet and placed them carefully into my bag. My mind drifted to my father, Thomas Reed. He had raised me with military discipline and a strict moral code long before I enlisted. He taught me that wealth was a tool, not an identity. When his investment firm grew into a massive hedge fund, he remained in the shadows, letting the world focus on the flashy billionaires while he quietly accumulated real power. He had begged me to sign a counter prenuptial agreement before marrying Harrison, warning me that corporate families viewed marriage as an acquisition. I had stubbornly refused, blinded by love and my own desire to prove I could build a life completely separate from his billions. I was wrong, and I was going to have to admit that to him very soon. I moved to my side of the bathroom and gathered my toiletries. The silence of the house was absolute, giving me too much space to think. I remembered the charity gala where Harrison and I first met. I had been in uniform representing my organization, and he had been the charming heir looking to make a charitable donation. He had spent the entire evening asking about my deployments, acting fascinated by my independence. I realize now that my independence was just a shiny novelty to him. He liked the idea of a strong woman until he actually had to live with one. When my nonprofit started requiring more of my time, and when I refused to attend superficial luncheons with his mother, the charm faded. He wanted a polished trophy, and I was a combat veteran who refused to be polished. I zipped my tactical bag shut and placed it by the bedroom door. I was fully packed and ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. But I was not leaving tonight. I laid down on top of the covers of the master bed, fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling. The silence of the house wrapped around me, but my mind was already mapping out the days ahead. I had to secure the Veteran Center. I had 12 former soldiers relying on my funding for their housing stipends this month. I could not let the Montgomery family use my organization as leverage during the divorce. They were ruthless enough to try and freeze my assets, hoping to starve me out. They underestimated my resourcefulness. I had managed supply chains in hostile territories where a single mistake meant losing lives. Navigating a divorce against a family of corporate narcissists was just another hostile territory. Tomorrow morning, the Montgomery family would undoubtedly try to force my hand. They would send someone to ensure I had accepted their terms and vacated the premises. Let them come. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to a veteran who never misses her mark. Morning light broke through the Brooklyn townhouse windows. I was already awake. I had slept exactly 4 hours, the optimal amount I needed during a deployment. I was out of bed before sunrise, dressed in tactical cargo pants and a plain black shirt. I drank my coffee black, standing in the center of the pristine kitchen, waiting. I knew the Montgomery family playbook. They operated on shock and awe, assuming rapid aggression would break their opponents. At exactly 8 in the morning, the front door lock clicked. I set my mug down on the counter. The heavy oak door swung open, and sharp designer heels echoed in the foyer. It was Caroline. At 30 years old, Harrison's younger sister was the golden child of the clan. She had never worked a day in her life, coasting on a trust fund and fabricated title at her father company. Behind her trailed three large men wearing identical gray uniforms. They were movers. Caroline stopped in the hallway, taking off her oversized sunglasses. She looked around the living room and sighed dramatically. I told Harrison to change the locks last night. I guess he was too upset to get it done. You guys, she snapped her fingers at the movers, head upstairs and pack everything. Use cheap boxes. Do not bother with bubble wrap for her stuff. It is worthless anyway. I stepped out of the kitchen, crossing my arms firmly over my chest. Nobody is going upstairs, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a commanding officer. The movers froze, looking between us. Caroline let out a grating laugh. Oh, Riley. Still trying to give orders like you are in a war zone. You do not live here anymore. My parents were very clear. You take the money and leave. Since you were too stupid to take the check, we are doing it the hard way. Go pack her trash, she barked again. I took 2 steps forward, placing myself directly between the staircase and the men. I looked the lead mover in the eye. I am the legal resident of this property. If you take 1 step up those stairs, I will call the police and press charges for breaking and entering. Your employer will be named in the lawsuit, and it will cost your job. The lead mover swallowed hard and took a cautious step back. Lady, we just take orders from the person paying the bill. We do not want legal trouble here. Caroline's face flushed red with sudden fury. I am paying the bill. My family owns this house. This woman is a gold digger refusing to leave. Move her stuff now, or I will make sure your company loses its contracts. The men did not budge an inch. They saw a frantic socialite screaming empty threats, and they saw a combat veteran standing perfectly still, absolutely ready to defend her ground physically if necessary. Caroline realized the movers were useless. She turned her rage entirely on me. You are so pathetic, Riley. Did you think you could marry into our family and stay forever? You are nothing but a charity case. Harrison only married you because it made him look good to the board. A rich executive saving a poor army girl. It was great public relations until you started acting like you actually belonged at our dinner table. I watched her childish tantrum with extreme clinical detachment. Your brother lied to me for 5 years, Caroline. He played the part of a supportive husband while bankrupting his soul to please your father. He was slumming it, Caroline sneered, stepping closer. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. You come from absolute trash. You grew up in some pathetic house in the Midwest eating government cheese and wearing hand-me-downs. You joined the military because you had absolutely no other options. You have no class, no relevant education, and zero value to a family like ours. My father is going to ruin you. He will make sure your stupid little veteran charity gets audited into oblivion. Her cruel words were meant to cut deep, triggering the shame she assumed I carried. She wanted me to scream, to cry, to validate her superiority. Instead, I felt a wave of profound relief. The Montgomery mask was completely off. They were showing me exactly who they were, saving me the trouble of feeling any guilt for what I was about to do to them. You talk about value. Caroline, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. You wear clothes you did not earn. You spend money you did not make. You exist entirely on a father who views you as a tax write-off. Do not ever speak to me about value. I have built a life on discipline and service. You have built a life on daddy credit card. Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. How dare you speak to me like that? You are getting thrown out on the street today. I brought the movers to take your garbage to a storage unit, but now I think I will just have them throw it all in the dumpster out back. Try it, I challenged her softly, stepping right into her personal space. Touch a single item I own, and I absolutely promise that you will leave this house in handcuffs. Caroline pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking with pure rage. I am calling my father. I am calling the police myself. We will see who leaves in handcuffs, you pathetic little leech. Before she could dial the number, the front door opened wider. A tall, impeccably dressed African-American man stepped into the foyer carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Jamal Caroline husband and the lead corporate lawyer for Montgomery Marine. His presence shifted the room energy immediately. He looked at the movers, his furious wife, and finally at me. The real game was about to begin. Jamal closed the heavy oak door behind him, with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo louder than Caroline and her frantic shouting. He stood in the grand foyer, an imposing and deeply composed figure, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. As the chief corporate counsel for Montgomery Marine, Jamal was accustomed to diffusing high-stakes disasters on a daily basis. He possessed a sharp legal mind and an even sharper understanding of human psychology. He looked calmly at the three paralyzed movers, then at his hyperventilating wife, and finally at me. I maintained my defensive stance at the bottom of the staircase, my muscles coiled and ready for a physical altercation. I had always harbored a quiet respect for Jamal. He was a brilliant, self-made African-American man who had navigated the treacherous and often deeply prejudiced waters of the Montgomery family politics with a quiet, lethal grace. Unlike my cowardly husband, Jamal possessed actual substance. Caroline immediately ran toward him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished hardwood floor. "Jamal, you need to fix this right now. This psychotic woman is threatening to have me arrested. I hired these movers to clear out her trash, and she is blocking the stairs like a lunatic. Call the police and have her forcibly removed for trespassing. She does not belong here anymore. My father wants her gone today." Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not mirror her chaotic energy. He simply reached out and gently placed a hand on Caroline's shoulder, stopping her aggressive tirade. He looked past her, fixing his dark, intelligent eyes on the lead mover. "Gentlemen," Jamal said, his voice smooth and deeply resonant, "I apologize for the confusion this morning. However, my wife is mistaken regarding the legal status of this residence. This property is still legally occupied by Mrs. Montgomery. Any attempt to remove her personal property without a formal court-ordered eviction notice constitutes an illegal lockout under New York state law. If you proceed, you and your employer will be held criminally liable, and my firm will absolutely not offer you any legal protection." The lead mover let out a massive sigh of relief, clearly thrilled to have a valid excuse to abandon this wealthy family nightmare. "We are out of here," the man said quickly. He signaled to his crew, and the three large men practically sprinted out the front door, eager to escape the suffocating tension of the townhouse. Caroline gasped, her face twisting in absolute betrayal. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, swatting his hand away from her shoulder. "You are supposed to be on our side. My father gave you strict orders to handle this divorce quickly and quietly. Why did you just send the movers away? She is squatting in our property." Jamal maintained his impenetrable calm. "Caroline, you cannot conduct an illegal eviction in broad daylight. Do you have any idea what kind of public relations disaster that would create? If Riley calls the police and the media catches wind that Montgomery Marine is illegally throwing a decorated military veteran out on the street, the board of directors will have our heads on a spike. The optics are a catastrophic liability. We are handling this through the proper legal channels, not through unhinged morning raids." Caroline opened her mouth to argue, but her phone suddenly began buzzing violently inside her expensive purse. She pulled it out and glared at the glowing screen. "It is my mother," she hissed. "Beatrice is probably calling to see if the trash has been taken out yet. I have to tell her that my own husband is actively protecting the enemy." "Take the call outside," Caroline, Jamal instructed smoothly. "Tell Beatrice that the legal team is executing the strategy exactly as planned, and that any aggressive moves right now will only jeopardize Harrison and his upcoming engagement announcement. Keep her calm. I will deal with Riley and get her to sign the preliminary separation agreements right now." Caroline glared at me one last time, her eyes filled with toxic hatred. "You are going to lose everything, Riley. Every single thing." She turned on her heel and stomped out the front door, slamming it shut behind her to answer her mother on the front sidewalk. The sudden silence in the foyer was heavy. Jamal and I were left completely alone. The corporate lawyer mask he wore so perfectly melted away the exact second the door clicked shut. His rigid posture relaxed, and the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, urgent intensity. He stepped away from the entryway and moved quickly toward the staircase, where I stood next to my heavy tactical duffel bag. I kept my guard up. I did not know whose side Jamal was truly on. He was married to the enemy, and his massive paycheck came directly from Richard Montgomery. "What is your play here, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. "Are you here to offer me another insulting check? Or are you going to threaten me with a mountain of legal paperwork?" Jamal shook his head. He looked toward the front window to ensure Caroline was still distracted outside on the pavement. "I am not here to fight you, Riley. I am here because I respect you, and because the Montgomery family is about to drag you down with a sinking ship. You need to listen to me very carefully, and you need to act fast." He stepped within an arm reach of me. With a swift, practiced motion, he unlatched his leather briefcase. He did not pull out a stack of legal contracts or a separation agreement. Instead, his hand hovered over the open case. Without breaking eye contact with me, he reached forward and slipped a small encrypted silver flash drive directly into the side pocket of my tactical duffel bag. My military instincts flared, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I looked down at the bag, then back up at Jamal. "What did you just give me?" "Your survival." Jamal whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Harrison did not just decide he wanted a high society wife out of the blue. Montgomery Marine is bleeding to death. Harrison made a series of catastrophic investments in our global shipping division. He bypassed the board of directors and hid the massive losses in offshore shell companies. He lost $200 million, Riley. The company is secretly on the verge of total bankruptcy. I absorbed the staggering information instantly. It made perfect sense. The sudden divorce, the desperate need for Harrison to marry a real estate heiress. They needed her family capital to plug the massive financial hole Harrison had blown in their corporate accounts. They are using the divorce to distract the board. Jamal continued rapidly, his eyes darting toward the window again. But it is much worse than that. Harrison needed liquid cash to cover up his initial margin calls 6 months ago. Look at the digital ledgers on that drive. Look at the financial records for your veteran charity. He did not just betray your marriage, Riley. He used you as a financial shield. He forged your signature. You need to get out of this house today, take that drive to a secure location, and prepare for a massive federal fallout. Before I could ask him to clarify the forgery, the front door handle began to rattle. Jamal instantly stepped back, snapping his briefcase shut and straightening his silk tie. His posture reverted to the icy, untouchable corporate lawyer. Caroline burst back into the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "My mother is losing her mind," she announced, glaring at me. "She wants to know if the parasite has agreed to leave yet." Jamal turned to his wife, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. "The situation is under control, Caroline. Riley understands the legal reality of her position. We are leaving now. She will vacate the premises shortly." Caroline scoffed, looking at my packed tactical bag. "Good. Take your garbage and get out of our city." Jamal placed a guiding hand on Caroline's back, steering her toward the exit. He did not look back at me. He simply escorted his furious wife out the door, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. The house was dead quiet once again. I reached down and slid my fingers into the side pocket of my bag. The cold metal of the flash drive rested against my skin. The Montgomery family thought they were discarding a helpless victim. They did not realize Jamal had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to annihilate their entire legacy. I left the keys on the marble entry table and walked out of the Brooklyn townhouse for the last time. I threw my tactical duffel bag into the passenger seat of my Ford pickup truck and merged onto the chaotic morning streets of New York City. The Montgomery family expected me to panic, to seek shelter with sympathetic friends, or crawl back to Ohio in disgrace. Instead, I drove deep into Queens, navigating away from the polished enclaves and pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a cheap, nameless roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered aggressively in the gray morning light. To me, it was perfect. It was off the radar, anonymous, and highly defensible. I walked into the cramped lobby and paid the clerk in cash for 3 nights. He slid a brass key across the scratched laminate counter, not bothering to ask for my identification. I took the key and drove my truck around to the back of the building, parking it flush against the concrete wall, so the license plate was completely hidden from the main road. I entered room number 12. The space smelled faintly of bleach and stale smoke. The floral bedspread had seen better decades, and the television was a bulky relic bolted to a cheap dresser. It was a far cry from the imported Italian sheets and heated floors of the master bedroom I had just vacated. I did not care. I dropped my bag onto the mattress and immediately went to work transforming the dingy room into a secure tactical command center. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains completely shut, plunging the room into darkness, save for the dull glow of the bathroom light. I retrieved my rugged military laptop from my duffel bag. It was a heavy, reinforced machine designed to survive sandstorms and drops from moving vehicles. I set it up on the small circular table, plugging it directly into the wall outlet. I bypassed the unsecured motel network entirely, activating a military-grade encrypted hotspot from my phone. Security was paramount. I was not going to give the Montgomery corporate IT department a single breadcrumb to follow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver flash drive Jamal had slipped into my bag. The metal was still cold. This piece of hardware held the key to the entire Montgomery empire. Jamal had risked his lucrative career, his marriage to Caroline, and his freedom to hand me this weapon. He had looked at the ruthless machinery of his wife family and chosen to sabotage it from the inside. I owed him a massive debt, but first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I inserted the flash drive into the USB port of my laptop. A password prompt instantly flashed across the screen. Montgomery Marine utilized standard corporate encryption software. It was designed to keep out curious journalists and corporate spies. It was completely useless against someone trained in cyber logistics and military intelligence protocols. I ran a brute force decryption program I had retained from my active duty days. The software chewed through the corporate firewall algorithms with ruthless efficiency. Less than 4 minutes later, the encryption shattered. A massive directory of folders populated my screen. I opened the master financial ledger. The numbers hit me like a physical shockwave. Jamal had not exaggerated the scale of the disaster. Harrison had completely decimated the global shipping division of his family company. I scrolled through thousands of rows of data tracking the catastrophic series of decisions my cowardly husband had made over the past 2 years. Harrison had aggressively bypassed the Senior Risk Management Board, using his status as the heir apparent to authorize massive, highly volatile investments in overseas shipping routes and unproven maritime technology startups. When those initial investments began to collapse, he had panicked. Instead of admitting his failure to his domineering father, Harrison had doubled down. He had taken out massive predatory loans to cover his margin calls, attempting to gamble his way out of the deficit. The losses snowballed exponentially. I traced the digital paper trail as Harrison desperately created offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, using them to hide the hemorrhaging funds from the annual shareholder audits. It was a textbook case of corporate fraud executed with the sloppy desperation of a man terrified of his own father. The final tally was staggering: $200 million. Harrison had effectively bankrupted the core division of Montgomery Marine. The company was a hollow shell propped up entirely by falsified quarterly reports and creative accounting. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair, letting the magnitude of the discovery wash over me. Everything made perfect sense now. The sudden urgency for a divorce, the desperate, cruel dinner ambush, the immediate need to discard me. I was not just an embarrassment to their social standing, I was an obstacle to their financial survival. The real estate heiress they had lined up for Harrison was not just a trophy wife. Her family was a $200 million bailout package. Richard and Beatrice were forcing Harrison to marry her so they could quietly merge portfolios and use her father capital to plug the hole in their sinking ship. They were selling their son to save their legacy. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Harrison was cornered desperate and facing federal prison if his crimes were exposed to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He tried to buy my silence for $50,000 while sitting on a $200 million fraud. But as I dug through the hidden folders looking for the source of the initial cover-up funds Harrison had used 6 months ago, my smile vanished. The satisfaction of exposing his corporate incompetence was replaced by a surge of blinding rage. I opened a folder labeled with the initials of my veteran nonprofit organization. What I saw inside made my blood run ice cold. I clicked open the folder labeled with the acronym of my veteran foundation. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh white glare as a series of scanned PDF documents populated the window. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while staring down hostile insurgents overseas, began to tremble. I opened the first document. It was a commercial loan agreement from a predatory private equity firm dated exactly 6 months ago. The principal amount listed in bold black ink was $150,000. The collateral listed against the loan was the operational grant account and the physical headquarters of my veteran rehabilitation center. I scrolled frantically to the bottom of the 50-page legal document. There, sitting above a solid black line, was my signature. Except it was not my signature. It was a meticulous, highly practiced forgery. Harrison had spent 5 years watching me sign tax returns, mortgage documents, and charity checks. He had memorized the sharp angles of my handwriting, the specific way I looped my capital letters. He had recreated it with terrifying accuracy, but as the person who owned that signature, I could spot the hesitation in the pen strokes. The pressure was all wrong. Harrison had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft, leveraging the absolute poorest and most vulnerable people in my care to secure a quick cash injection for his failing corporate empire. I opened the next file. It was a series of automated warning letters from the private equity firm. Harrison had defaulted on the loan. He had used the $150,000 to temporarily mask a margin call on his disastrous overseas shipping investments, hoping he could replace the stolen charity funds before anyone noticed. But the shipping losses had snowballed too fast. The money was gone. The private equity firm was initiating asset seizure protocols. By the end of this month, federal auditors would freeze the charity bank accounts. The government would seize our headquarters. The human cost of this betrayal crashed over me like a suffocating wave. I thought about Sergeant Miller, a double amputee who relied on our housing stipend to keep a roof over his family. I thought about Private Jenkins, who attended our daily group therapy sessions to manage his severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Harrison knew these people. He had shaken their hands at my charity galas. He had smiled in their faces, posed for photographs with them to boost his public image, and then he had secretly signed their lifeline away to save his own pathetic skin. He had stolen from wounded veterans. The rage that ignited inside me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. When Harrison asked for a divorce at the restaurant, I felt a bruised ego and a sense of wasted time. When Caroline insulted my upbringing this morning, I felt a clinical detachment from their shallow existence. But this was different. This was a direct attack on my soldiers. In the military, you never leave a fallen comrade behind. Harrison had not just left them behind. He had pushed them directly into the line of fire to shield himself. I continued digging through the digital files, piecing together his exact timeline. 6 months ago, the shipping deficit became impossible for Harrison to hide using standard corporate accounting. He panicked. He knew if his father Richard discovered the $200 million loss, Harrison would be stripped of his vice president title and exiled from the family trust. So he forged my signature to steal the charity funds, buying himself a few months of breathing room. During those few months, Richard and Beatrice arranged his marriage to the real estate billionaire daughter. The entire plan hinged on getting me to quietly sign the divorce papers and accept the $50,000 bribe. If I took their severance package and walked away, Harrison could use his new bride family money to silently pay off the forged charity loan before the federal auditors knocked on my door. I would have never known he committed the fraud, and he would have walked away completely clean. It was a brilliantly evil strategy, reliant on my supposed financial desperation. They assumed a girl from a working-class background would leap at a $50,000 check. They assumed I would take the money and run, leaving my charity accounts vulnerable, and my name attached to a massive federal crime. If the auditors ever did investigate the defaulted loan, the paper trail would point entirely to me. Harrison had set me up to take the fall for a federal felony. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet darkness of the motel room. The glowing screen faded to black. The air felt thin. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. I looked at the blank screen for a long time. The Montgomery family had scheduled their annual high society charity gala for next week. It was their crown jewel event, a massive public relations spectacle where Richard and Beatrice paraded their wealth in front of New York elite. I knew they would try to force me to attend one last time, using the threat of liquidating my nonprofit to ensure I played the part of the compliant, soon-to-be ex-wife. They wanted a smooth public transition. They had no idea that they had just given me the ultimate motivation to attend. I was not going to hide in this motel room. I was going to put on my sharpest suit, walk into their glittering ballroom, and watch them smile for the cameras. I would let them think their plan was working perfectly. I would let Harrison believe his dirty secret was safe. And then, when the moment was right, I was going to use my father's $8 billion war chest to tear their dynasty apart, brick by brick. The Montgomery family wanted a war. They were about to get a massacre. 7 days passed since I sat in that dark motel room and uncovered the financial rot at the center of Montgomery Marine. 7 days of meticulous planning, encrypted phone calls, and securing the perimeter around my life. Then came the ultimatum. It arrived on a Tuesday morning via a courier delivered directly to the front desk of my veteran rehabilitation center. It was a formal letter, printed on heavy embossed Montgomery Marine stationery, signed personally by Richard. The message was legally polished, but its true meaning was unmistakably clear. The letter stated that the corporate board was currently reviewing all charitable affiliations for the upcoming fiscal year. It casually mentioned the defaulted loan attached to my foundation, noting that Montgomery Marine might be forced to expedite the federal seizure to distance their brand from financial insolvency. However, the final paragraph offered a temporary stay of execution. It demanded my presence at their annual philanthropic gala this Saturday night. I was instructed to stand beside Harrison, smile for the press, and present a united front to their shareholders. If I refused to play the dutiful, oblivious wife one last time, Richard would personally ensure the private equity firm seized my headquarters by Monday morning. He was holding the very survival of my wounded veterans hostage just to secure a photo opportunity. He thought I was trapped. He thought he had successfully backed a helpless woman into a corner. He had no idea I had spent the entire week fortifying my position with resources he could not even fathom. I replied that I would be there. Saturday night arrived with a bitter chill in the Manhattan air. The gala was being held at the Pierre Hotel, an opulent fortress of crystal chandeliers, gold leaf molding, and absurd wealth. For the past 5 years, Beatrice had dictated my wardrobe for these events. She would send over suffocating beaded gowns that cost more than a military transport vehicle, forcing me to dress like a delicate porcelain doll, so I would blend in with her country club friends. Tonight, I was dressing for myself. Tonight, I was dressing for battle. I stood in front of the motel mirror and adjusted my collar. I wore a tailored charcoal black suit cut with absolute military precision. The lines were sharp, clean, and completely unforgiving. I paired it with a crisp white silk shirt and black leather Oxfords polished to a mirror shine. I wore no jewelry, no diamonds, no distracting accessories. My hair was pulled back tightly into a sleek, disciplined knot. I looked exactly like what I was, a former United States Army logistics officer preparing to dismantle an enemy operation. When I pulled my Ford pickup truck up to the valet stand at the Pierre Hotel, the attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking my keys. I stepped out into the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras lined up behind the velvet ropes. I ignored the shouts of photographers asking for Harrison and walked up the grand marble staircase with my head held high. The grand ballroom was a sea of haute couture. Hundreds of New York elite floated across the room in trailing silk gowns, velvet tuxedos, and millions of dollars worth of borrowed jewelry. Waiters navigated the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and corporate desperation. I scanned the room with a tactical eye, assessing the exits, identifying the key players, and locating the center of gravity. It did not take long to find them. The Montgomery family was holding court near the main stage, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy investors and sycophantic board members. Richard stood tall and arrogant, gripping a glass of scotch, while loudly recounting some fabricated story of corporate triumph. Beatrice stood beside him, draped in emerald green satin, her eyes constantly darting around the room to monitor their social standing. I walked directly toward them, parting the sea of glittering guests, simply by moving with unyielding purpose. The dark, sharp lines of my suit cut a stark contrast against the pastel gowns surrounding me. I could feel the stares. I could hear the hushed whispers rippling through the crowd as people noticed the blatant defiance in my attire. I was not playing the role of the compliant corporate wife, and high society abhors nothing more than a disruption to their visual expectations. Beatrice spotted me first. Her smile froze instantly. She excused herself from a conversation with a banking executive and intercepted me before I could reach the inner circle. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into the sleeve of my suit jacket. "What on earth are you wearing, Riley?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a toxic whisper to avoid drawing attention. "You look like a security guard. I sent a custom designer gown to your office yesterday. Why are you intentionally trying to humiliate us tonight?" I looked down at her hand gripping my arm until she felt the sheer hostility radiating from me and slowly let go. "I am wearing reality, Beatrice," I said evenly. "I am not your show pony anymore. You demanded my presence under threat of destroying my charity. You did not specify a dress code for the extortion." Her face flushed dark red beneath her expensive makeup. "You listen to me. Richard is making a critical speech tonight. The investors who are going to save Harrison and his career are in this very room. You will stand by my son, you will smile for the cameras, and you will not say a single word to the press. If you step out of line for even 1 second, your little veteran center is gone by Monday morning. Do you understand me?" I looked past her shoulder. Harrison was standing a few feet away, watching our interaction with barely concealed panic. He looked pale, sweating slightly inside his tuxedo. The pressure of his massive financial fraud was clearly eating him alive from the inside out. "I understand perfectly, Beatrice," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I understand exactly what is at stake tonight. I will stand right where I need to stand, and I will watch Richard give his speech. I would not miss it for the world." Beatrice narrowed her eyes, searching my face for any sign of weakness or surrender. Finding none, she adjusted her diamond necklace and plastered her fake aristocratic smile back onto her face. "Just remember your place, Riley." She turned and glided back to her husband. I remained standing on the edge of their circle, a solitary figure in a dark suit watching the glittering illusion of the Montgomery Empire. The orchestra played a sweeping waltz. The champagne flowed like water. They were celebrating their survival, completely unaware that the floor beneath them had already collapsed. I checked my watch. The gala schedule indicated that Richard would take the stage in exactly 20 minutes. 20 minutes until the Montgomery family executed the next phase of their public betrayal. I stood perfectly still amidst the sea of haute couture, waiting for the signal to strike. The clinking of silverware against fine bone china faded as the string quartet brought their performance to a close. A heavy hush fell over the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. The master of ceremonies, a minor television personality hired specifically for his booming theatrical voice, stepped up to the crystal podium. He tapped the microphone, the sharp sound cutting through the murmurs of the New York elite. He introduced Richard Montgomery with the kind of excessive, breathless reverence usually reserved for visiting royalty or heads of state. Richard strode onto the massive stage. He looked every bit the master of the universe, his silver hair catching the bright theatrical lights, his rigid posture radiating absolute corporate authority. The crowd erupted into polite, synchronized applause. Down on the ballroom floor, Beatrice positioned herself perfectly in the front row, pulling Harrison tightly to her side. She shot me a vicious warning glare, a silent command to step forward and complete the visual illusion of their family portrait. I moved to the edge of their inner circle, ensuring I was highly visible in my charcoal suit, a dark, disciplined stain against their pastel perfection. Richard grasped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone with a practiced, deeply benevolent smile. "Welcome, distinguished guests, valued shareholders, and dear friends," he began, his voice echoing off the vaulted gold leaf ceiling. "Tonight we gather to celebrate the enduring philanthropic spirit that has driven Montgomery Marine for over a century. We fundamentally believe that true corporate leadership requires a steadfast, unwavering commitment to the local communities we serve." The audience murmured in immediate approval. Richard continued weaving a masterful, deceptive narrative of global charity, environmental sustainability initiatives, and community outreach. He painted Montgomery Marine as a shining beacon of corporate morality, entirely masking the dark reality that his own son had just cratered their shipping division and engaged in massive federal wire fraud. I watched Harrison out of the corner of my eye. He was sweating profusely, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles were stark white. He swallowed hard every single time his father mentioned financial integrity or ethical corporate governance. Then Richard shifted his weight. His benevolent, welcoming smile vanished completely, replaced by an expression of solemn, heavy corporate responsibility. "As we look aggressively toward the future," he announced, "Montgomery Marine is currently undergoing a comprehensive organizational restructuring. To maintain our rigorous standards of absolute excellence, we must occasionally make highly difficult decisions regarding our long-standing charitable partnerships. We have a fundamental duty to our shareholders to ensure every donated dollar is optimized for maximum impact and absolute financial transparency." The massive room grew uncomfortably still. The investors in the front rows leaned forward, instantly sensing the sudden shift in tone. This was no longer a standard self-congratulatory gala speech. This was a calculated public execution. For the past 5 years, Richard continued his cold gaze, drifting deliberately down from the elevated stage to lock squarely onto me. We have been the primary corporate benefactor for a local veteran rehabilitation center. It is an organization closely tied to our own family. However, during our recent quarterly corporate audits, we discovered that the foundation leadership has severely failed to meet the rigorous financial compliance standards required by Montgomery Marine. A collective gasp rippled through the packed ballroom. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously, their judging eyes landing squarely on my dark tailored suit. The whispering started instantly, a vicious hiss of high society gossip spreading rapidly through the glittering crowd. Due to severe financial irregularities and a complete lack of operational transparency within the Veteran Center, Richard declared, his voice booming relentlessly over the massive speakers, "Montgomery Marine is officially severing all ties and terminating all funding to the organization effective immediately. We cannot, in good conscience, continue to support a foundation that demonstrates such reckless financial mismanagement. We must fiercely protect our corporate integrity." The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. Richard was standing in front of the most powerful financial players in New York City, publicly accusing my veteran charity of financial irregularities when he knew exactly who had caused them. Harrison had explicitly forged my signature to steal $150,000 from wounded, vulnerable soldiers. Richard was not just cutting my operational funding. He was preemptively framing me for his son committing federal crimes. He was burning my entire professional reputation to the ground, so that when the federal auditors finally arrived, the narrative was already firmly established. The poor, incompetent Army veteran could not handle the complex finances, and the noble Montgomery family had to cut her loose to save themselves from her alleged crimes. Beatrice looked at me with a triumphant, deeply venomous smirk. She fully expected this public humiliation to break my spirit. She thought I would run crying from the ballroom, securing their fabricated narrative of the disgraced, incompetent wife, fleeing in absolute shame. I did not move a single muscle. I stood still, my shoulders squared, my chin high. I locked eyes with Richard on that stage, and I did not blink. I let the cruel whispers wash over me. I let the judgmental stares of the real estate moguls and the elite socialites hit my suit and bounce off. In the military, you are taught to absorb the shock of an unexpected explosion, assess the collateral damage, and hold the line. This was their best artillery, and it felt like nothing but a warm breeze. Richard faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected me to shatter under the weight of the room. Seeing me stand there unfazed sent a visible ripple of deep unease across his face. He quickly recovered, clearing his throat loudly and pivoting the speech toward their new, exciting philanthropic ventures, desperately trying to steer the energy of the room back to his absolute control. But the damage was done, and the trap was perfectly set. They had played their hand exactly as I needed them to. By publicly severing ties with my foundation and citing financial irregularities on the public record, Richard had legally separated Montgomery Marine from my organization just days before I unleashed the federal evidence. He thought he was building a firewall to protect his cowardly son. He did not realize he had just securely locked himself inside the burning building. The speech concluded to thunderous, relieved applause. The orchestra immediately struck up a lively tune to cut through the lingering, heavy tension. The crowd began to mingle again, though a wide, empty circle instantly formed around me. I was officially a pariah in their elite world. I stood my ground, my expression entirely unreadable. The public execution was over, but the night was just beginning. I watched as Harrison wiped his sweating forehead with a silk handkerchief and turned toward the lobby doors, anxiously waiting for the arrival of his actual salvation. I watched as Harrison wiped his sweating forehead with a silk handkerchief and turned toward the grand lobby doors, anxiously waiting for the arrival of his actual salvation. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, pulled back by two hotel staff members in perfect synchronization. A sudden flurry of bright camera flashes spilled into the ballroom from the foyer. The society photographers, who usually remained cordoned off near the red carpet, were suddenly being ushered inside by Beatrice's personal public relations team. This was a highly orchestrated maneuver. The Montgomery family was setting the stage for their next distraction. Through the flashing bulbs and the parting crowd walked Isabella Vanguard. She was the only daughter of Preston Vanguard, a ruthless commercial real estate tycoon whose Manhattan empire was worth billions. Isabella looked exactly like the corporate savior Beatrice had designed her to be. She wore a cascading silver gown that caught every ambient light in the room, her blonde hair styled in flawless, expensive waves. She moved with the terrifying, unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Harrison immediately rushed to meet her. The nervous sweat that had coated his face during his father's speech magically vanished, replaced by a practiced, blindingly bright smile. He reached out, took Isabella by the hand, and pulled her close to his side. The photographers went absolutely wild. The shutter clicks sounded like rapid gunfire. Harrison leaned in and kissed her on the cheek, wrapping his arms securely around her waist. He was publicly flaunting his new companion, showcasing his infidelity to the entire New York elite, while his legal wife stood less than 50 feet away. Beatrice stepped directly into the frame, beaming with toxic pride. She placed one hand on Harrison's shoulder and the other on Isabella's arm, presenting them to the cameras as the definitive future of the Montgomery Marine dynasty. This was her masterpiece. By publicly severing ties with my foundation and instantly presenting Isabella as the new woman in Harrison's life, Beatrice was controlling the narrative with brutal efficiency. The message to the shareholders was crystal clear. The company was shedding its problematic, incompetent baggage and merging with massive, reliable wealth. I stood my ground, observing the sickening spectacle with absolute military detachment. In a combat zone, you learn to track enemy movements without giving away your own position. I watched the way Harrison clung to Isabella. It was not affection. It was a desperate, drowning man clinging to a solid gold life preserver. He needed her father's capital to cover the $200 million crater he had blown in his own shipping division. He was selling his soul, his marriage, and his remaining dignity to avoid federal prison. The photographers finally lowered their cameras, shouting their thanks, as Beatrice's public relations handlers guided them back out to the foyer. With the photo opportunity successfully concluded, Harrison and Isabella began to navigate the ballroom floor. Beatrice proudly paraded them from one group of wealthy investors to another. I could read her lips from across the room. She was introducing Isabella as Harrison's incredibly special guest and the exciting new direction for their family. The sheer disrespect was staggering. My divorce papers had not even been filed with the city courts, yet I was already being openly replaced in front of the people who funded my charity. As the orchestrated procession moved through the room, they inevitably steered toward my side of the ballroom. Beatrice was steering them deliberately. She wanted to ensure I saw my replacement up close. She wanted to break my composure, hoping I would finally scream, or throw a glass of champagne. She desperately needed me to act like the unstable, discarded woman she had painted me to be. I did not move. I held my glass of sparkling water, my posture remaining perfectly rigid inside my sharp charcoal suit. Harrison saw me standing there and hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fake smile faltering. But Beatrice pushed him forward, a firm hand pressing against his spine. They stopped mere feet away from me. Isabella looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my tailored, austere suit with mild, undisguised amusement. She clearly knew exactly who I was. Beatrice had undoubtedly briefed her on the poor, uncultured army veteran who was currently being evicted from the Montgomery legacy. "You must be Riley Isabella," said her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Her tone was the audio equivalent of a venomous snake. "Beatrice told me all about your little charity project. It is such a shame about the financial mismanagement. I suppose dealing with complex corporate funds is quite a bit different than packing cardboard boxes in a warehouse. You really should leave the heavy lifting to the professionals." Harrison shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet my eyes. "Riley," he muttered, his voice lacking any real authority, "you really should not be here anymore. My father made the company position extremely clear. It is best for everyone if you just leave the gala now." I looked at Isabella, analyzing her shallow arrogance before turning my gaze slowly back to my husband. The contrast between my calm demeanor and his nervous, erratic energy was stark. "I am standing exactly where I need to be, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and deadly quiet. "I find it fascinating that you are so eager to lecture me on financial mismanagement. Tell me, Isabella, does your father know he is buying a sinking ship? Or did Harrison forget to mention that little detail during your romantic dinners?" Isabella frowned, her artificial smile slipping slightly as she glanced at Harrison. "What on earth are you talking about?" Harrison panicked. The blood drained completely from his face. He recognized the dangerous edge in my voice. He knew I had access to his home, his office, and potentially his files. He did not know exactly what I had uncovered, but the sheer terror of exposure paralyzed him. He grabbed Isabella by the elbow, pulling her back. "Do not listen to her, Isabella," Harrison said quickly, his voice cracking with sudden desperation. "She is just bitter. She is lashing out because she ruined her own foundation. Please go grab us some drinks from the bar. I need to handle this situation." Isabella looked highly offended by his sudden rough handling, but Beatrice quickly swooped in, linking arms with the billionaire heiress. "Come along, my dear," Beatrice cooed smoothly, glaring daggers at me over her shoulder. "Let Harrison deal with the trash. We have board members waiting to meet you." As Beatrice led a confused Isabella away toward the champagne tower, Harrison turned back to me. The fake society smile was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. His chest heaved as he struggled to control his breathing. The walls were closing in on him, and he knew it. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, grabbing my forearm with a tight, aggressive grip. "We need to talk," Harrison hissed through gritted teeth, his eyes darting around the room to ensure no one was watching us. "Right now." In the hallway, I looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve. "Let go of me," I commanded softly, "or I will break your wrist in front of your new girlfriend." Harrison instantly snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. But the desperate, cornered animal look in his eyes remained. He turned and marched rapidly toward the side exit leading to the private corridors of the hotel. I waited for 2 seconds, letting him sweat before I calmly followed him out of the glittering ballroom and into the quiet, dim hallway where the real extortion was about to begin. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the orchestral waltz and the obnoxious laughter of the corporate elite. The hallway was dimly lit by crystal wall sconces, creating long, distorted shadows against the floral wallpaper. Harrison paced back and forth across the thick carpet. He was pulling at his silk collar like a man gasping for air. When he turned to face me, the polished corporate vice president was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, pathetic little boy who had finally realized his actions had real-world consequences. "What do you know?" Riley Harrison demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. He took a step toward me, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "What were you talking about in there? What do you think you know about my shipping investments?" I stood perfectly still, maintaining my tactical distance. "I know everything, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I know about the offshore shell companies in Cyprus. I know about the catastrophic margin calls. I know you bypassed the Senior Risk Management Board and blew a $200 million crater in the center of Montgomery Marine. And I know that Isabella and her father are nothing more than a desperate bailout package designed to keep you out of a federal penitentiary." Harrison stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. The last remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the wall sconces. He leaned heavily against the flocked wallpaper, his chest heaving. His eyes darted toward the ballroom doors, terrified that his father or his new billionaire savior might walk through them and hear his absolute ruin. "You hacked my files," Harrison accused, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "You stole confidential corporate data. That is a federal crime, Riley. I will have you arrested tonight." I tilted my head, studying his desperate attempt to regain leverage. "You really want to talk about federal crimes, Harrison?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. "Let us talk about commercial loan agreements. Let us talk about $150,000 stolen from a private equity firm. Let us talk about how you forged my signature to put my veteran rehabilitation center up as collateral to cover your own pathetic gambling debts." Harrison stopped breathing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The threat of corporate exposure was bad, but the reality of federal wire fraud and identity theft was a death sentence. He knew I had him completely cornered. Suddenly, his entire demeanor shifted. The aggressive stance vanished, replaced by a sickening, manipulative vulnerability. He reached out, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Riley, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I was drowning. My father was going to destroy me if he found out about the shipping losses. I needed temporary liquidity just to keep the margin callers at bay until the merger went through. I was always going to pay it back. I would never actually let the bank seize your veteran center. You have to believe me." I looked at the man I had married. The cowardice rolling off him was physically repulsive. You used wounded soldiers as a financial meat shield, Harrison. You looked me in the eye every single night while secretly signing away the sanctuary of the people I swore to protect. There is absolutely no justification for what you did. Harrison closed the distance between us. I can fix this right now, he said, his eyes wild with frantic negotiation. I have the power to make this entire nightmare go away. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded stack of thick legal documents. He shoved them toward me. These are the finalized divorce papers, Riley, and a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. If you sign these documents right here, right now, I will personally guarantee that the $150,000 loan is paid off by tomorrow morning. Your veteran center will be completely free and clear. You will save your soldiers. I stared at the paperwork trembling in his sweaty hands. This was his master plan: emotional blackmail. He was holding the survival of my foundation hostage, offering to clean up his own criminal mess, only if I legally bound myself to absolute silence. He wanted me to accept the blame for the financial irregularities his father had just announced on stage. He wanted me to disappear as the disgraced, incompetent wife, leaving him looking like the noble victim. Sign the papers. Riley Harrison pushed, his tone turning forceful again. If you walk away tonight without signing, I will let the private equity firms seize your headquarters on Monday. My father will ensure you never receive another corporate donation in this city. You will lose your life work, and your veterans will be thrown out onto the street. You owe it to them to take this deal. Do the right thing. The sheer audacity of his manipulation was breathtaking. He was attempting to use my sense of duty, the core value of my military service, to force my compliance. He thought my loyalty to my soldiers would override my sense of self-preservation. He thought I was weak. I looked down at the documents, then back up into his terrified eyes. You are offering to pay off a loan with money you do not even have, Harrison. You are completely broke. You are relying entirely on Isabella and her father to write that check, and you are banking on my silence to secure that marriage. I have secured a bridge loan from an independent backer. Harrison lied smoothly, though a bead of sweat tracing down his temple betrayed him. The money is ready. I just need your signature. Do not be stupid, Riley. You cannot fight my family and save your charity at the same time. Take the deal. Protect your veterans. I did not reach for the pen he was holding out. I did not look at the papers again. I simply buttoned the center button of my charcoal suit jacket, shifting my posture into a rigid, impenetrable stance. You made a catastrophic tactical error, Harrison, I said, my voice echoing with icy, unyielding authority. You assumed my charity was the only asset I had to protect. You assumed my soldiers were my only leverage. You forgot that in a war the most dangerous enemy is the one whose supply lines you cannot see. Harrison frowned, confusion momentarily masking his panic. What are you talking about? Sign the damn papers, Riley. I am not signing anything, I replied, stepping around him toward the exit doors. You can keep your forged loan, your fake bridge backers, and your pathetic attempts at blackmail. I am leaving this gala, Harrison. Enjoy the rest of your evening with your billionaire savior. You are going to need a lot of champagne to digest what happens on Monday morning. I pushed open the heavy hotel exit doors, stepping out into the freezing New York rain, leaving Harrison standing alone in the dim hallway, clutching his useless paperwork, completely unaware of the absolute devastation heading toward his corporate empire. The heavy brass doors of the Pierre Hotel slammed shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating warmth and the faint, sickening strains of the ballroom orchestra. Freezing rain lashed against my face, a sharp and welcome contrast to the toxic atmosphere I had just escaped. The Manhattan street was a chaotic blur of flashing brake lights, yellow cabs, and frantic pedestrians seeking shelter. I did not run or hunch my shoulders against the downpour. I walked down the marble steps with the steady, measured pace of a soldier leaving a successfully rigged demolition site. The water soaked quickly through my charcoal suit jacket, but the cold felt clarifying. It washed away the last lingering traces of the dutiful wife I had pretended to be for 5 years. The paparazzi huddled under the grand awning barely registered my departure. They were still waiting for the billionaire heiress and the dashing corporate vice president to make their triumphant exit. I bypassed the valet stand completely, my polished leather Oxfords splashing through the freezing puddles as I headed toward the dark side street where I had parked my truck. The vehicle sat exactly where I left it, an unglamorous, heavy-duty machine that perfectly mirrored my own resilience. I unlocked the heavy door, climbed inside the dark cabin, and slammed it shut, sealing myself inside a quiet, impenetrable fortress. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the metal roof. I took one deep, stabilizing breath, letting the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebb from my bloodstream. Harrison had played his final hand. He had attempted to use my honor and my loyalty to my wounded veterans as a weapon against me. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my service. A commander does not negotiate with terrorists holding hostages. A commander eliminates the threat. I reached into the inner pocket of my damp jacket and pulled out a heavy matte black mobile phone. It was not the sleek, commercially available device Harrison and his corporate friends used to conduct their fragile business deals. It was a customized, military-grade encrypted satellite phone, the kind of hardware that left absolutely zero digital footprint routing signals through secure offshore servers. I powered on the screen, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark cabin of the truck. There were no contacts saved in the directory, no applications, and no message history. I navigated to the secure dialer and typed in a complex 12-digit numerical sequence I had committed to memory years ago. I pressed the call button and raised the cold device to my ear. The line clicked once, routing through the encrypted channels before ringing a single time. The voice that answered on the other end was deep, gravelly, and radiated absolute, unyielding authority. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms, shattered international conglomerates, and manipulated global markets from the shadows. "Speak," the voice commanded. "Dad." I said, my voice steady and resolute in the quiet truck. "It is me." Thomas Reed let out a slow, heavy exhale. The sound carried a mixture of profound relief and dangerous anticipation. "Riley, I have been sitting in my study waiting for this frequency to activate. Tell me you are safely out of that hotel." "I am in my truck." I confirmed, watching the rain distort the streetlights through my windshield. "The extraction is complete." My father did not ask if I was crying. He did not ask if my heart was broken. He knew me better than that. He knew the daughter he had raised with ironclad discipline and a ruthless understanding of leverage. "What is our tactical status?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly from concerned father to predatory billionaire. "They crossed the line," I stated flatly, the words tasting like cold steel in my mouth. "Richard just publicly announced the termination of my veteran charity funding in front of his entire shareholder base. He used fake financial irregularities as his excuse." Then Harrison cornered me in the hallway. He tried to blackmail me into signing the divorce papers and a non-disclosure agreement tonight. He offered to pay off the forged loan if I stayed quiet and let him play the victim. He is parading Isabella Vanguard around the ballroom right now to secure her father real estate capital. A dark, menacing chuckle rumbled through the encrypted line. Thomas Reed was a man who appreciated the sheer arrogance of his enemies, mostly because it made crushing them so much more satisfying. "They are arrogant, desperate fools," my father said. "Richard thinks he is playing three-dimensional chess, but he is just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. And Harrison is a coward who believes a forged signature and a rich girlfriend can save him from a federal indictment. They have no idea what they have just unleashed. They think I am a penniless soldier with no resources," I said, gripping the steering wheel tight. "They think I am going to hide in a motel and cry while they steal my organization and destroy my reputation entirely." My father's voice turned deadly serious. "You are Riley Reed. You are the sole heir to an $8 billion empire. You do not hide from anyone. Are you ready to proceed with the primary objective?" "I am ready," I answered without a single ounce of hesitation. "Activate the clause. Consider it done, Thomas said, the satisfaction evident in his tone. I am authorizing Triton Holdings to drop the corporate veil immediately. By tomorrow morning, my legal team will file the necessary injunctions to freeze every single liquid asset connected to Montgomery Marine. We hold 65% of their debt, Riley. When the markets open on Monday, we are calling in the entire balance. Richard will be functionally bankrupt before his morning coffee. What about the board meeting on Monday? I asked. They are absolutely not going to sign anything my father promised. I will have the injunctions filed the second the courts open. Get some rest, Riley. Monday belongs to us. I ended the call and slipped the heavy satellite phone back into my jacket. The rain continued to pound against the windshield of my truck, but the cold inside me had settled into a steady burning focus. I started the engine and drove back to the anonymous motel. I did not sleep that weekend. I spent Saturday night and all of Sunday reviewing the encrypted files, memorizing every single fraudulent transaction Harrison had made, and coordinating with Jamal through a secure channel to ensure our timing was flawless. Monday morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving light of a clear Manhattan skyline. At 9 o'clock sharp, the atmosphere inside the Montgomery Marine executive boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, fresh leather, and unearned arrogance. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their Wall Street skyscraper, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a sweeping view of the harbor. It was designed to intimidate, to make anyone sitting across the massive mahogany table feel small and insignificant. Richard Montgomery stood at the head of the table, projecting the absolute pinnacle of corporate dominance. He wore a fresh, bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating a smug, victorious energy. He had spent the entire weekend convincing himself that the public execution of my veteran charity at the gala had effectively neutralized his only vulnerability. In his mind, he had successfully severed the rotting limb to save the body of his empire. Sitting to his immediate right was Harrison. My soon-to-be ex-husband looked significantly better than he had in the hotel hallway. The paralyzing terror had been replaced by a shaky, desperate relief. He was wearing a new silk tie, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, and offering practiced smiles to the men across the table. He truly believed he had gotten away with it. He believed his forged signature and his stolen charity funds were permanently buried under the weight of his new corporate alliance. Across the table sat Preston Vanguard, the billionaire commercial real estate mogul, flanked by his daughter Isabella. Preston was a shark. He was a large, imposing man with a booming voice and a reputation for gutting distressed properties. He knew Montgomery Marine was struggling, though he did not know the catastrophic extent of the $200 million deficit. He viewed this merger as a hostile takeover wrapped in a wedding ribbon. For a 30% equity stake in the legacy shipping company, Preston was injecting enough liquid capital to cover what he thought were standard operational losses. In exchange, his daughter would become high society royalty, and his real estate empire would gain a massive logistical arm. Isabella sat beside her father, looking bored and wealthy. She tapped her manicured nails against the mahogany table, occasionally glancing at her reflection in her phone screen. She was not interested in the financial mechanics of the deal. She was interested in the title, the status, and the upcoming feature in elite society magazines. Harrison placed his hand over hers, playing the part of the devoted fiancé with nauseating sincerity. At the far end of the table sat Jamal. As the chief legal officer for Montgomery Marine, his presence was mandatory to oversee the execution of the merger documents. He wore an immaculate navy blue suit, his expression a masterpiece of professional neutrality. He meticulously arranged the towering stacks of contracts, merger agreements, and equity transfer forms. Richard barked orders at him, demanding he expedite the signature pages, treating his brilliant son-in-law like a glorified administrative assistant. Jamal simply nodded his face, giving absolutely nothing away. Only I knew the intense, calculated anticipation burning behind his eyes. He had placed the explosive charges, and now he was just waiting for me to hit the detonator. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice echoing across the expansive room, "I want to personally thank Preston for his vision and his commitment to the future of Montgomery Marine. This strategic partnership represents a monumental shift in our global operational capacity. Together, we are going to dominate the eastern seaboard and secure this dynasty for the next century. Preston Vanguard let out a loud, booming laugh and unbuttoned his suit jacket. "Let us cut the poetry," Richard Preston said, pulling a solid gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. "We both know why we are here. You need my capital to modernize your aging fleet, and I need your maritime infrastructure to bypass my commercial transport bottlenecks. It is a highly profitable synergy. And frankly, I am glad to see Harrison finally trading up. That previous distraction of his was a terrible look for your shareholders." Harrison chuckled a weak, cowardly sound. "It was an error in judgment, Preston. But that chapter is completely closed. The paperwork is being finalized today, and she is out of the picture." "Excellent," Preston declared, slamming his hand flat on the table. "Then let us make you some money, son." Jamal stood up smoothly and slid the final execution contracts across the polished wood toward Richard and Preston. He placed the signature pages perfectly in the center of the table. The champagne bucket sitting on the side credenza was already chilling 2 bottles of vintage champagne. Beatrice and Carolyn were waiting in the executive lounge down the hall, ready to rush in and pop the corks the exact second the ink dried. Richard picked up his pen. His hand was remarkably steady for a man standing on the edge of a massive federal indictment. He looked at his son, sharing a look of profound, arrogant triumph. They had beaten the system. They had crushed the poor Army veteran, covered up a multi-million-dollar fraud, and secured their legacy forever. Preston Vanguard uncapped his gold pen, leaning forward over the contract. He positioned the nib directly over the dotted line. The entire room held its breath. The future of Montgomery Marine was literally seconds away from being secured. Then the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom flew open with a violent shattering force. Preston Vanguard uncapped his gold pen, leaning forward over the contract. He positioned the nib directly over the dotted line. The entire room held its breath. The future of Montgomery Marine was literally seconds away from being secured. Then the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom flew open with a violent shattering force. The glass panels struck the rubber doorstops with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Preston Vanguard froze his gold pen, hovering a mere inch above the signature line. Everyone at the massive mahogany table snapped their heads toward the entrance. I walked into the room. I was not wearing the humble clothes of a struggling veteran, nor the subdued outfit of a compliant corporate wife. I wore a tailored, razor-sharp, midnight blue suit that commanded absolute authority. My posture was rigid, my expression a mask of pure ice. Flanking me on either side were 2 men who looked like they ate corporate executives for breakfast. They were senior litigation partners from my father's legal team, wearing pristine, tailored suits, carrying thick leather briefcases, and exuding an aura of absolute ruthless financial power. Richard Montgomery shot out of his chair, his face flushing a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, his voice vibrating with unfiltered rage. "How did you get past the reception desk? You have absolutely no authorization to be on this floor. Security. Someone call security immediately and have this woman thrown out on the street." I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward the center of the room, my polished heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. My 2 litigators stepped smoothly to the side, physically blocking the entrance so nobody could enter or exit the boardroom. Harrison looked like he had just seen a ghost. The smug, victorious grin he had been wearing moments ago melted off his face, replaced by a sickening, chalky pallor. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard, his knuckles turned completely white. He tried to speak, but his jaw just moved soundlessly, paralyzed by the sheer terror of my sudden arrival. Isabella Vanguard let out an annoyed huff, crossing her arms over her chest. "Who let the angry ex-wife into the building?" she muttered, looking at me with intense disdain. "Harrison, handle this embarrassment before my father signs the final equity transfer." I stopped directly across from Richard and Preston Vanguard. I looked down at the merger documents spread out across the table. Then I unclasped the leather folder I was carrying. Nobody is signing anything today, Preston, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that instantly silenced the room, unless you actively enjoy being indicted as a co-conspirator in a massive federal cover-up. Preston Vanguard lowered his gold pen, his thick eyebrows knitted together in a deep frown. He looked at Richard, then back at me, his predatory business instincts instantly flaring. What cover-up, Preston demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Who are you, and what exactly are you accusing my future partners of doing? Richard slammed his fist onto the table. Do not listen to a single word she says, Preston. She is a bitter, discarded woman having a mental breakdown because my son finally had the sense to divorce her. She is trying to extort us for a larger settlement. I will handle this. He reached for the desk phone to summon the guards. I ignored Richard entirely. I opened my leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution financial documents. I did not hand them to Richard. I slammed them down onto the mahogany table right on top of the merger contracts Preston was about to sign. My name is Riley, I said, maintaining direct eye contact with the billionaire real estate mogul. I am the woman Harrison is currently trying to divorce so he can use your family capital to bail himself out of a $200 million deficit. The silence in the boardroom became absolute. The number hung in the air like a live grenade. Preston Vanguard froze. Isabella gasped, her artificial confidence shattering instantly. Richard stopped reaching for the phone, his face draining of all color. That is an absolute lie, Richard shouted, though his voice cracked with a sudden underlying panic. Our financials are fully audited and completely transparent. We are a legacy institution. I pulled out the next set of documents and slapped them down next to the first stack. These are the internal ledgers for your global shipping division, Richard. They show a $200 million crater caused by your son bypassing the Senior Risk Management Board over the last 2 years. He hid the catastrophic losses in offshore shell companies located in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. He has been falsifying your quarterly reports for the last 6 months to keep you completely in the dark. Richard turned his head slowly, looking at his son. Harrison was shrinking into his chair, sweating profusely, unable to make eye contact with his father. The horrifying realization began to wash over the chief executive officer. His legacy, his empire was entirely hollow. But that is not why I am here today. I continued, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension. I dropped the final, most damning piece of evidence onto the table. It was the commercial loan agreement from the private equity firm, bearing the forged signature. 6 months ago, when the margin calls on those disastrous shipping investments came due, Harrison needed liquid cash immediately to hide his incompetence from you, Richard. So he forged my signature on this federal commercial loan agreement. He stole $150,000 by putting my veteran rehabilitation center up as collateral. He used the most vulnerable soldiers in this city as a financial meat shield to cover his own pathetic gambling debts. Preston Vanguard leaned forward, ignoring Richard entirely, and picked up the loan agreement. He scrutinized the documents, his eyes scanning the forensic breakdown my legal team had prepared, showing the clear forgery. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was not a fool. He knew a legitimate federal paper trail when he saw one. Is this true, Harrison? Preston asked, his voice deadly calm. Did you forge your wife's signature to steal charity funds to cover up a massive corporate deficit? Harrison opened his mouth, stammering, trying desperately to form a coherent sentence. It was a misunderstanding, he pleaded, his voice cracking. The funds were just a temporary bridge loan. I was going to pay the charity back the second your investment capital cleared our accounts today. I swear it was just a temporary fix. The room erupted. Isabella jumped out of her chair, looking at Harrison with absolute disgust. You were going to use my father money to pay off a stolen charity loan. You broke, pathetic liar. At that exact moment, the elevator doors down the hall chimed, and 4 large security guards rushed toward the boardroom. They burst through the entrance, ready to physically remove me. One of my litigators calmly stepped forward, reaching into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a stack of court-stamped documents and held them up to the lead security guard. "Federal injunctions," the litigator announced in a booming authoritative voice. "Any attempt to remove my client from this premises will result in immediate charges of obstruction and assault. Stand down." The guards hesitated, looking at Richard for confirmation. But Richard was completely paralyzed. He was staring at the loan documents on the table, realizing that his son had not just ruined the company financially, but had committed severe federal crimes that would drag the entire Montgomery family into a criminal investigation. Preston Vanguard threw his gold pen onto the table. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. He looked at Richard with pure, unfiltered contempt. "You tried to sell me a bankrupt company wrapped in a federal wire fraud investigation. If I had signed those papers, my entire real estate empire would have been tied to your son's criminal liabilities." "Preston, please." Richard begged, his arrogant facade completely destroyed. "We can fix this. We can restructure the deal." "I had no idea he did this," Preston sneered. "The deal is dead, Richard, and so is your company. Come on, Isabella, we are leaving." As the billionaire mogul and his daughter stormed out of the boardroom, pushing past the confused security guards, I looked down at Harrison. He was ruined. He had lost his bailout, his reputation, and his future. But the real execution was still to come, because Jamal was finally ready to make his move. The heavy oak doors swung shut as Preston and Isabella Vanguard abandoned the sinking ship, sealing the Montgomery family inside the boardroom with their worst nightmares. Richard stood frozen at the head of the mahogany table, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He looked at his son Harrison, who was hyperventilating in his leather executive chair, and then turned his frantic eyes toward the far end of the room. He looked at the one man he believed could conjure a legal loophole out of thin air. Jamal. Richard barked, his voice cracking with a desperate edge. "Do your job. Call security and have this woman detained for corporate espionage. Draft an immediate gag order. We need to bury these forged documents and file a defamation lawsuit against her before Vanguard reaches the ground floor." Jamal did not rush to obey. He did not scramble for his phone. He calmly pushed his chair back, stood up, and buttoned his immaculate navy blue suit. He walked slowly around the edge of the massive table. He picked up the stack of internal ledgers and the commercial loan agreement I had slammed down earlier. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the papers with the chilling detachment of a federal prosecutor inspecting a crime scene. "Well," Richard demanded, slamming his fist against the wood, "stop reading and start fixing this disaster." Jamal set the documents back down on the table. He looked directly at his father-in-law. "I cannot do that, Richard," Jamal said, his rich voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel, "because these documents are entirely authentic." Harrison let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. Richard took a step back, his face twisting in absolute disbelief. "What are you saying? You are the chief legal officer of Montgomery Marine. You are supposed to protect this family." "I am a licensed corporate attorney," Jamal corrected smoothly. "My fiduciary duty is to the shareholders of this corporation, not to the criminal endeavors of its negligent executives. The evidence Riley has presented today is irrefutable." Harrison bypassed the risk management board, hid $200 million in losses using offshore shell companies, and committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to cover his margin calls. "If I attempt to bury this evidence, I become an accessory to a federal felony. I will not lose my license to protect your incompetent son." Before Richard could formulate a response, the side door swung open. Caroline rushed into the room holding 2 crystal champagne flutes. She had been waiting in the executive lounge, expecting to celebrate the merger that would save her lavish lifestyle. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the 2 Wall Street litigators blocking the main entrance, Harrison sobbing quietly into his hands, and me standing tall in my midnight blue suit. "What is going on?" Caroline shrieked, dropping the champagne flutes onto a side table. "Where are Preston and Isabella? Why is this trashy woman standing in our boardroom? Jamal, kick her out right now." Jamal turned slowly to face his wife. The polished facade he had worn for the entirety of their marriage was completely gone. He looked at her with terrifying clarity. "Caroline," he said, his voice stripped of affection, "your brother just bankrupted your entire family legacy. He stole money from wounded veterans to hide his catastrophic shipping losses. Montgomery Marine is functionally insolvent, and Harrison is facing multiple federal indictments." Caroline's face turned a sickly shade of white. She looked at her father, then at Harrison, waiting for them to furiously deny the allegations. When neither man spoke, the horrific reality finally registered. She turned back to her husband, her eyes wide with desperate terror. "Jamal, you have to fix this. You are the smartest lawyer in New York. You have to find a way to protect our money. We cannot lose our trust funds. You have to protect us." Jamal let out a hollow laugh that held absolutely zero humor. "Protect us," he repeated, shaking his head. "Caroline, your family has spent the last 6 years treating me like a glorified legal servant. You paraded me around your country club dinners to prove how progressive you were, while your father undermined my legal authority behind closed doors. You spent our marriage treating my career as a convenient shield for your endless financial liabilities. I am done protecting you." Richard lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at his son-in-law. "You ungrateful traitor. I gave you your career. I made you chief legal officer. You work for me. You will destroy this evidence, or I will make sure you never practice law again. You do not have the power to destroy anyone anymore." Richard Jamal replied with devastating calmness. "In fact, to preserve my own legal standing and comply with federal reporting requirements, I formally submitted a data file containing all of Harrison's fraudulent internal ledgers to the Securities and Exchange Commission at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." The air vanished from the room. The absolute finality of Jamal's words struck the Montgomery family like a physical blow. He had not just refused to help them, he had proactively delivered the kill shot to the federal government. "You reported us!" Harrison choked out, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical pitch. "You turned us into the federal government. I fulfilled my legal obligation," Jamal stated, unbothered by the sheer panic radiating from the men across the table. "I refuse to let your cowardly actions drag me down into the dirt." Caroline let out an agonizing sob, collapsing against the side credenza as her knees gave out. Her perfect world was disintegrating right in front of her eyes, and the husband she treated like a disposable asset was holding the sledgehammer. She looked at Jamal with unadulterated betrayal, realizing she was completely defenseless. Richard stood paralyzed at the head of the table. He looked from the damning loan documents to the weeping form of his daughter, to the utterly broken shell of his son, and finally to Jamal, who was calmly adjusting his suit cuffs. The Montgomery patriarch was completely isolated, stripped of his power, his leverage, and his wealth in a matter of minutes. Jamal turned his back on his ruined family and looked directly at me. He offered a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of our synchronized strike. The stage was perfectly set. The Montgomerys were bleeding out on their own boardroom table. Now it was time for me to deliver the final revelation that would permanently bury them. "Gentlemen," Jamal said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the boardroom. The two security guards who had rushed in moments earlier stood frozen by the door, unsure of who possessed the actual authority in the room anymore. Jamal gestured smoothly toward me with an open palm. "You have spent the last 5 years addressing this woman as Riley Montgomery. You have treated her as an accessory, a public relations liability, and a disposable asset. That ends right now. I am formally introducing her not as Harrison's estranged wife, but in her official legal capacity." Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white. "What capacity?" he wheezed, his voice stripped of all its former booming arrogance. "She runs a charity. She is a soldier. What legal capacity could she possibly hold in this building? I am the sole authorized proxy and acting executive representative for Triton Holdings," I announced, stepping fully into the light cast by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Triton Holdings was a legend on Wall Street. It was a massive, notoriously aggressive hedge fund known for swallowing failing corporations whole and liquidating their assets with surgical precision. 4 years ago, during a brief but terrifying market downturn, Montgomery Marine had nearly gone under. An anonymous firm had swooped in quietly, purchasing their toxic debt and stabilizing their supply chain. That firm was Triton. Richard had spent years trying to discover the identity of his mysterious corporate savior, desperate to buy back the debt and regain full autonomy over his family empire. He had never succeeded. Richard staggered back, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. Triton Holdings. He repeated the syllables, trembling on his lips. That is impossible. Triton is controlled by Thomas Reed. He is a ghost. He never sends proxies. And he certainly does not employ amateur charity workers. I picked up the final folder from the mahogany table and tossed it directly at Richard's chest. It hit him and scattered across the polished wood. Thomas Reed is not just the chief executive officer of Triton Holdings, I said, watching his eyes dart over the official authorization documents bearing the golden Triton seal. He is my father. Harrison let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He gripped the sides of his head, his eyes bulging as his brain short-circuited, trying to process the magnitude of his colossal mistake. Your father, Harrison choked out, his voice cracking wildly. Your father is Thomas Reed, the billionaire. You told me your dad was a retired mechanic in Ohio. I told you my father worked with his hands and valued hard work. I corrected him, my tone laced with absolute freezing contempt. He taught me to fix engines before he taught me how to read balance sheets. I wanted a husband who loved me for my character, not my trust fund. My father warned me about families like yours. He warned me that you were opportunistic leeches masquerading as high society royalty. I defended you, Harrison. I spent 5 years hiding my inheritance because I genuinely believed you were a good man. You lied to me. Harrison whimpered, his face wet with tears of absolute despair. We were drowning in debt. I was terrified of losing the company. If you had just told me you had access to that kind of capital, I would never have done any of this. I would never have looked at Isabella. We could have saved the company together. The sheer, unadulterated cowardice of his statement made my stomach turn. You did not want a partner, Harrison, I said, stepping closer to the table looming over his trembling frame. You wanted a bailout. You thought I was poor, so you treated me like garbage. You let your mother slide a $50,000 check across a dinner table to buy my silence. $50,000. My father generates that amount in interest every 4 seconds. You threw away an $8 billion dynasty for a real estate heiress who just abandoned you the second she realized you were broke. Caroline, who was still slumped against the side credenza, let out a choked, hysterical laugh. She looked at me with wild, bloodshot eyes, her pristine makeup completely ruined by her tears. You, she gasped, pointing a shaking finger at me. I called you trash this morning. I told the movers to throw your things in the dumpster. I told you that you were a charity case living on our dime. You did. I agreed, not breaking eye contact with my ruined sister-in-law. And I told you that you built your entire life on your daddy credit card. Now his credit card is maxed out, his company is insolvent, and the debt is entirely owned by my family. Richard finally found his voice, though it lacked any of its former thunder. It was a weak, gravelly plea of a broken man facing total annihilation. Riley, listen to me. We are still family. We can fix this. Triton Holdings owns our debt, but we still hold the operational infrastructure. If you call your father, if you just explain that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, we can restructure the debt. We can give you a seat on the board. You can have whatever you want. I looked at the older man, absolutely disgusted by how quickly his arrogance had dissolved into groveling submission. I already have whatever I want, Richard. Triton Holdings currently owns exactly 65% of your total corporate debt. We hold the absolute majority. We do not want a seat on your board. We own the board. We own the ships, the lucrative government contracts, the international warehouses, and the very building we are all standing inside right now. You are completely and permanently finished, Richard, and there is no escape anymore. Richard sank into his chair, watching his legacy evaporate. Beside him, Harrison wept the reality of impending poverty, shattering his fragile ego. But I was not finished. The corporate takeover was only the first phase. The personal reckoning was about to begin. I focused on my treacherous husband. I reached into my folder and pulled out a thick legal document bearing a golden notary seal from 5 years ago. I dropped it onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud right next to the forged commercial loan agreement. "Do you recognize this document, Richard?" I asked. "I am sure you do. You paid corporate lawyers a small fortune to draft it when Harrison proposed to me. You were terrified that a poor Army veteran was trying to steal your family wealth. You demanded I sign it before giving us your blessing." Richard stared at the thick stack of paper, his eyes widening in sudden terror. "It was the prenuptial agreement. You told me it was standard corporate procedure." I continued pacing slowly around the table. "You told me it was designed to protect the Montgomery Empire from opportunistic gold diggers. You made sure the terms were incredibly aggressive, ensuring that if we ever divorced, I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. I signed it without argument because I did not care about your money. I loved him." Harrison buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. He knew exactly what was inside that document. Jamal stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked down at the prenuptial agreement with a cold smile. "As the chief legal officer, I am intimately familiar with the Montgomery family legal strategies," Jamal said. "Richard insisted on including a specific aggressive morality and financial fraud clause in this prenup. He wanted to ensure that if Riley ever attempted to embezzle funds or engage in criminal behavior damaging the Montgomery brand, she would face immediate financial ruin." I nodded, stopping right behind Harrison's chair. "That is absolutely correct, Jamal. Richard built a perfect, inescapable legal trap. He never imagined his own son would step into it." I leaned down, placing my hands on the high back of Harrison's leather chair. "Clause Section 4, Paragraph B, Harrison. Do you remember what it says? Or were you too busy planning your next golf trip to read the fine print?" Harrison choked on a sob. I straightened up and addressed the room. "The clause explicitly states that if either party commits severe financial fraud, forgery, or malicious criminal conduct against the other spouse during the marriage, the offending party immediately forfeits their entire personal portfolio, all liquid assets and all vested trust funds to the victimized spouse. It was designed to annihilate me if I ever stole from you." Richard lunged forward, grabbing the prenuptial agreement with trembling hands, frantically flipping through the pages, as if hoping the ink had magically rearranged itself. "You forged my signature, Harrison," I declared, pointing a sharp finger at the commercial loan agreement sitting on the table. "You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to steal $150,000 from my veteran rehabilitation center. You used my name and my life work to commit a severe financial crime. That action directly triggers your father's ironclad morality clause." Harrison let out an agonizing wail. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, stripped of his dignity. "Riley, please," he begged, his voice cracking wildly. "Please, do not do this. I have nothing else. If you take my trust fund, I am ruined. I will be homeless. I will have nothing." I looked down at the pathetic man I had sworn to protect. "You had everything, Harrison. You had a wife who loved you, a comfortable life, and a secure future. You threw it all away because you were too arrogant to admit you made a mistake at work. You tried to buy my silence for $50,000 while secretly planning to let federal auditors seize the sanctuary of wounded soldiers. You deserve absolutely nothing." I turned back to Richard, who was staring at the prenup in complete shock. His own legal weapon had just been turned around and fired point blank into his son's chest. "Because of your brilliant legal foresight, Richard, I announced your son is leaving this marriage with exactly what he tried to leave me with: zero. By the end of business today, my legal team will execute the asset transfer. Every single dollar in Harrison personal accounts, every share of his vested stock, and the entirety of his trust fund now legally belongs to me. He is functionally bankrupt. Caroline, still slumped against the credenza, let out a sharp gasp. She looked at her brother kneeling on the floor, realizing that the golden boy of the Montgomery family was now poorer than the veterans he had tried to exploit. The hierarchy of their toxic family had been demolished. "You destroyed us," Richard whispered, his voice sounding hollow and ancient. "You planned this execution perfectly." "I did not destroy you," I corrected him, maintaining my icy composure. "I just held up a mirror." "You destroyed yourselves with your greed, your arrogance, and your unbreakable legal contracts. I simply refuse to be your collateral damage. I am taking Harrison's personal assets. I am liquidating his trust fund, and I am injecting every single penny of his wealth into my veteran charity. Your son is going to fund the rehabilitation of the soldiers he tried to steal from." Harrison collapsed completely, curling into a tight ball on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. He was a broken, penniless man, facing federal indictment, and his billionaire safety net had just walked out the door. The Montgomery family was trapped in a financial prison of their own making, and I held the only key. Near the frosted glass doors of the boardroom, Preston Vanguard and his daughter Isabella had been temporarily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the sudden carnage. They tried to storm out, but the terrifying reality of Harrison losing his entire personal fortune to a morality clause had kept them rooted to the carpet. Preston was a man who understood numbers, but he also understood criminal liability. Listening to the methodical breakdown of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement, the billionaire real estate mogul finally comprehended the lethal blast radius of the Montgomery family collapse. Preston turned his massive frame toward Richard. The look of absolute disgust on his face was enough to melt steel. "You did not just try to sell me a bankrupt company," Preston bellowed, his voice vibrating with unchecked fury. "You tried to chain my daughter to a federal inmate. You tried to use Vanguard real estate money to pay off stolen charity funds. If I had signed those merger documents, my entire empire would have been subpoenaed by the Securities and Exchange Commission before lunchtime." Richard opened his mouth, raising a trembling hand to placate the furious billionaire. "Preston, I swear to you I did not know the extent of his crimes. We can separate Harrison from the board. We can still salvage the maritime infrastructure." Preston let out a sharp, booming laugh that held zero warmth. "Salvage what, Richard? You do not own anything anymore. Triton Holdings owns you. Your son is entirely bankrupt. You are facing federal indictment for corporate negligence. You are a dead man walking, and I will not let your rotting corpse contaminate my family name." Isabella stood frozen in her dress, looking at Harrison as if he were a diseased animal. The man she had been parading around the charity gala just a few days ago was sobbing on the hardwood floor, stripped of his trust fund, his title, and his dignity. She dropped the engagement ring onto the floor. It bounced against the polished wood and rolled away near Harrison's trembling knees. "I am not marrying a penniless felon," Isabella sneered, stepping backward. "You disgust me, Harrison." Preston did not wait for another word. He grabbed Isabella and dragged her out of the boardroom. The doors swung shut behind them, sealing the Montgomery family inside the tomb of their ruined dynasty. The billionaire bailout was officially gone, taking the last shred of their false hope with it. I turned my attention back to the mahogany table. The personal reckoning was complete. Harrison was financially annihilated. Now it was time to execute the corporate takeover. I signaled to the litigators flanking me. They stepped forward, opening their leather briefcases and extracting a stack of corporate resolutions. Richard watched them with wide, bloodshot eyes. "What are those?" he demanded, his voice barely a raspy whisper. As the sole authorized proxy for Triton Holdings, I announced, my voice projecting absolute, unyielding command. "I am exercising our right, as the majority debt holder, to call an immediate emergency shareholder vote. Because Montgomery Marine is in severe breach of its financial covenants, and because its executive leadership has engaged in documented federal fraud, Triton Holdings is executing a hostile management restructuring. Effective right. This exact second. Richard slammed his hands flat on the table, trying to summon the ghost of his former authority. You cannot do that. Corporate bylaws require a 30-day notice for any executive restructuring. You cannot just walk in here and vote me out. I am the chief executive officer. I looked at Jamal, who was standing quietly near the window. Jamal stepped forward, picking up the corporate resolutions. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his ruined father-in-law. Actually, Richard Jamal said with devastating professional calm, under Section 8 of the Corporate Charter, majority shareholders can bypass the 30-day notice period if the presiding executive officers are found liable for gross financial negligence or criminal misconduct. By forging Riley's signature and defaulting on a commercial loan, Harrison provided Triton Holdings with the exact legal mechanism needed to trigger an immediate hostile takeover. I looked Richard dead in the eye. I am officially casting the voting majority of Triton Holdings. Richard Montgomery, you are hereby terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Montgomery Marine, effective immediately. You are stripped of your board seat, your executive privileges, and your operational authority. I turned my gaze down to the pathetic weeping figure on the floor. Harrison Montgomery, you are terminated as Vice President. You are stripped of your corporate immunity, your company assets, and your severance package. You no longer work here. You no longer own this building. You are both entirely unemployed. Richard staggered backward, clutching his chest, as if he were having a heart attack. The empire his grandfather had built, the legacy he had ruthlessly defended by crushing anyone beneath him, was gone. He looked around the boardroom, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the mahogany table, and the corporate logo. He was a trespasser in his own castle. You planned this, Richard choked out, gasping for air. You and your billionaire father. You orchestrated this entire execution to steal my company. I did not steal anything, Richard. I corrected him, my tone even. My father bought your debt 4 years ago to save you from bankruptcy. We gave you a chance to run this company with integrity. Instead, you chose to protect your cowardly son while he committed federal crimes, and you chose to throw me away like garbage to secure a quick payout. You handed me the weapon. I just pulled the trigger. The Wall Street litigators slid the termination documents across the table. Sign the transfer of authority, Richard Defy commanded, or my legal team will have you escorted out in handcuffs for trespassing on Triton property. The execution was final. Richard stared at the termination documents as if they were laced with poison. His hand shook violently as he reached for the pen Preston Vanguard had abandoned on the table. He looked around the boardroom one last time, searching for a single ally, a single loophole, or a momentary reprieve. There was nothing but the cold, calculating stares of my legal team and the absolute finality in my eyes. Defeated, Richard signed his name. He pushed the paper across the mahogany wood. Harrison did not even hesitate. My former husband snatched the pen from his father and scribbled his signature with frantic, terrified speed, terrified that any delay would result in immediate federal arrest. The physical transfer of power was officially complete. The Montgomery dynasty was dead. I handed the signed documents to my litigator. He inspected the signatures and slid them into his briefcase. I turned my attention to the 2 security guards still standing near the frosted glass doors. They had been hired by Richard, paid by Montgomery Marine, and trained to protect the executive floor. I looked the lead guard directly in the eye. As of this exact second, I instructed, my voice clear and authoritative. Montgomery Marine is under the direct operational control of Triton Holdings. You now work for me. These 2 men are no longer employees, executives, or authorized personnel. Escort Mr. Montgomery and his son out of my building immediately. They are not permitted to return to their offices. They are not permitted to access their corporate computers or collect any files. They will leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs. If they resist, call the local police precinct and have them arrested for criminal trespassing. The lead guard straightened his posture. He recognized a shift in the chain of command. Yes, ma'am, the guard responded. He gestured toward the open doors. Let us go, gentlemen. Time to leave the premises. Richard tried to maintain a shred of his aristocratic dignity. He stood up adjusting his suit jacket, but his hands were trembling too violently to fasten the button. He did not look at me as he walked toward the exit. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of a man. Harrison, however, could barely stand. He stumbled away from the table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked back at me one final time, his eyes pleading for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I offered him nothing. I stood perfectly still, watching as the security guards flanked my treacherous ex-husband and his tyrannical father. They marched them out of the executive boardroom, down the long, carpeted hallway, and straight into the waiting elevator. The doors slid shut, effectively erasing them from the corporate empire they had ruled through fear and fraud. The heavy silence in the boardroom was shattered by a sudden, desperate sob. Caroline pushed herself away from the side credenza. She had watched her father and brother get thrown out of their own building like common criminals, and the horrifying reality of her new existence was finally crashing down on her. She stumbled toward the center of the room, her designer shoes clicking erratically against the floor. She ignored me entirely and threw herself at her husband. "Jamal," she cried, grabbing the lapels of his immaculate navy blue suit. "Jamal, you have to do something. You have to call the judges. You have to file an appeal. They cannot just take our company. They cannot take my trust fund. How are we going to pay the mortgage on the estate? How am I going to pay for my memberships? You have to fix this right now." She shook him, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his jacket. She was not mourning the loss of her family legacy. She was mourning the loss of her limitless bank account. She looked at Jamal not as a partner, but as a magic wand she could wave to make the bad things disappear. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not comfort her. He gently but firmly reached up and removed her hands from his jacket. He took one step back, creating a deliberate, insurmountable physical boundary between them. "I am not fixing anything, Caroline," Jamal said, his voice echoing with a profound, liberating calmness. "Your father and your brother committed massive federal crimes. They stole from veterans. They committed corporate fraud. I spent 5 years watching your family treat people like garbage. I watched you treat me like an accessory. You could parade around your country club while your father insulted my legal expertise behind closed doors. I am completely done cleaning up your messes." Caroline stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in sheer panic. "But you are my husband," she pleaded. "You are the chief legal officer. You have to protect us." Jamal reached into his sleek leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents neatly bound in a blue folder. He held them out to her. "I am no longer the chief legal officer for Montgomery Marine," Jamal corrected her smoothly. "And as of this morning, I am no longer your husband." Caroline looked down at the blue folder. The words printed on the front page were unmistakable. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." She let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, snatching her hands away as if the folder was on fire. "You are divorcing me," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are leaving me right now. When we have nothing." Jamal dropped the divorce papers onto the mahogany table where her father had surrendered the company. "I am leaving you because you have nothing inside you, Caroline. You actively participated in throwing Riley out on the street. Now experience what losing everything feels like." Jamal turned to me, offering a respectful nod. "Let us go." We walked out together, leaving Caroline alone to face the absolute ruin of her family legacy. The heavy glass doors of the Montgomery Marine skyscraper slid shut behind us for the final time. The elevator ride down to the lobby was remarkably quiet, but it was the silence of absolute victory. Jamal and I stepped out onto the bustling Manhattan street, breathing in the crisp, unpolluted air. We did not look back at the towering monument to corporate greed we had just dismantled. We simply walked toward the waiting black car, ready to build something entirely new from the ashes. 6 months later, the landscape of New York high society had fundamentally changed. The Montgomery family, once considered untouchable royalty, had become a cautionary tale whispered about at elite dinner parties. The federal fallout from Harrison committing wire fraud and identity theft was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not just audit their shipping division, they completely gutted it. Richard Montgomery was stripped of his remaining dignity and indicted on multiple counts of corporate negligence and financial conspiracy. His massive estates in the Hamptons and his penthouse in the city were seized by federal authorities to pay off the staggering debts he owed to Triton Holdings. He was currently awaiting trial confined to a tiny rented apartment in New Jersey, far away from the exclusive country clubs that had immediately revoked his memberships. Beatrice, the woman who had sneered at my working-class background and tried to buy my silence with $50,000, was now selling her beloved emerald necklaces and designer handbags online just to cover her husband mounting legal fees. Harrison had it the worst. The morality clause in our prenuptial agreement had legally stripped him of every single penny in his personal portfolio and his vested trust fund. Left entirely bankrupt, he was forced to rely on a public defender for his criminal trial. The real estate heiress Isabella Vanguard had blocked his number the minute she walked out of that boardroom. Without her father capital to bail him out, Harrison was left utterly defenseless against the federal prosecutors. He was currently residing in a cheap, nameless motel in Queens, ironically exactly where his arrogant father had told me to go. As for Caroline, Jamal executed the divorce with the same surgical precision he used in the boardroom. Because he had kept his own finances strictly separated and legally insulated from the Montgomery family toxic assets, she walked away with nothing. The golden child, who had never worked a day in her life, was forced to take a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a mid-level dental clinic. She learned very quickly that the real world does not care about your last name when your credit cards are declined. I stood on the wide, sunlit steps of the Thomas Reed Veteran Rehabilitation Center, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The massive state-of-the-art facility spanned 3 city blocks in upstate New York. It was a beacon of hope built entirely from the ground up, using the liquidated assets I had legally extracted from the Montgomery family. Harrison's stolen trust fund had paid for the advanced physical therapy wing. Richard's seized corporate bonuses had funded the comprehensive mental health department. I had taken their dirty money and transformed it into a sanctuary for the bravest men and women in the country. The campus was buzzing with life. Veterans were walking through the landscaped gardens, attending job training seminars in the glass-walled classrooms, and receiving top-tier medical care without worrying about predatory loans or crushing debt. I had promised my soldiers that I would never leave them behind, and I had kept that promise. Jamal stepped out of the main administrative building and walked over to stand beside me on the steps. He looked sharper and more relaxed than he ever had during his miserable marriage. As the newly appointed chief legal officer for Triton Holdings, he managed the philanthropic legal framework for the entire hedge fund. He had found a career that actually valued his brilliant mind, rather than a family that only valued his ability to clean up their messes. "Everything is ready for the ribbon-cutting ceremony," Riley Jamal said, handing me a sleek tablet containing the day schedule. "The governor is waiting in the reception hall, and the National Press Corps has set up their cameras near the podium. Your father is watching the live feed from his office." I looked at the tablet, then out at the sprawling campus. I wore a tailored dark green suit today, a subtle nod to my army roots paired with my polished combat boots. I did not need to wear uncomfortable designer heels to prove my worth. I did not need to hide my military service to fit into a shallow corporate mold. I was exactly who I was meant to be. "Tell the press. We will begin in 5 minutes," I instructed, handing the tablet back to him. "And make sure Sergeant Miller gets a front row seat. He just finished his prosthetic fitting this morning, and I want him to be part of the official photograph." Jamal smiled, a genuine expression of profound respect. "Consider it done." "You built something incredible here, Riley. You took the absolute worst moment of your life and turned it into a masterpiece." I looked up at the bold steel letters spelling out the name of the facility against the bright blue sky. I thought about the terrified, desperate woman sitting in that dark motel room 6 months ago, staring at a forged loan document and wondering how she was going to survive. I thought about the cruel, arrogant family who tried to crush me simply because they thought I was poor and defenseless. They had underestimated my strength, my discipline, and my relentless determination to fight for what was right. They tried to bury me, I said quietly, watching a group of veterans laughing together near the courtyard fountain. But they did not realize I was a seed. I walked down the steps and headed toward the podium, ready to face the flashing cameras and the cheering crowd. I was no longer the discarded corporate wife. I was Riley Reid, a combat veteran, a billionaire chief executive officer, and a woman who had completely rewritten her own destiny. I had walked through the fire, burned down the enemy's stronghold, and emerged entirely victorious. I was thriving, unapologetic, and completely in control. The dramatic saga of Riley and the Montgomery family offers a profound lesson on the danger of underestimating others and the true nature of self-worth. Throughout the story, the Montgomery family operates under the fatal assumption that wealth and social pedigree are the only valid measures of a person's value. They view Riley's military service and dedication to her veteran nonprofit not as marks of character, but as embarrassing social liabilities. Because they are blinded by their own arrogance and greed, they completely fail to recognize her immense resilience, strategic brilliance, and the quiet power she holds. They mistake her humility for weakness, a devastating miscalculation that ultimately leads to their spectacular financial and social downfall. The core takeaway from this narrative is that authentic power does not require a loud performance, flashy titles, or constant external validation. Riley endures relentless belittlement from her husband and his parents, yet she never loses sight of her core identity. She does not need to flaunt her billionaire lineage to feel secure. Her confidence is forged in the fires of real-world sacrifice, discipline, and service to others. When she finally strikes back, it is not merely for petty, vindictive revenge against those who wronged her. Instead, she acts to enact swift justice, dismantle a corrupt corporate system, and protect the vulnerable veterans who fiercely depend on her foundation. Her triumphant victory proves that unwavering integrity, patience, and strategic discipline will always outmaneuver superficiality, cowardice, and deceit. We are powerfully reminded that our true wealth lies in the strength of our character, the firm boundaries we enforce, and the higher purpose we choose to serve every single day. Take a moment to evaluate the relationships in your own life today, and never shrink yourself to fit into rooms where your true worth goes unrecognized.